Attention, Lance Corporals and Lieutenant Generals. My name's Danny Whitaker. This is My Own Worst Enemy, mental health podcast. Alright, at ease, relax, it's fine. So just a little clue there, if you're wondering, today's episode, we're going to be talking about military psychology. And we're going to be coming at it from a evolutionary perspective and with emphasis on PTSD. However, before we get into all that, so my guest today, the guy I'm talking to, is Dr. Hector Garcia. And his specialities are things like combat and masculinity and evolutionary psychology. So when I was doing a bit of research leading up to our conversation, I stumbled across this article he'd written, and it's called The Hipster, the Bearded Ape, and God, the Evolutionary Psychology of Beards in Apes, Men, and God. Now, of course, well, not of course, you might not know, I happen to be a bearded gentleman, so this article was of particular interest to me. So, yeah, I gave it a read, and definitely worth talking about. So, now, I don't know why I grew a beard, right? I can't remember if I did it just to see if I could grow one, and then I liked it, so I kept it. Maybe it was part of, like, an early midlife crisis. You know, I couldn't afford a little two-seater roadster with a big spoiler on the back, so I grew a beard instead. I'm pretty sure it was a fashion thing, though. Like, so I've got to the age now where my hair started falling out, right? I'm 35. I can't do anything with it, right? When your hair is as thin as mine is, every attempt at styling it looks like a comb over, right? So I've just got to sort of leave it and let it do its own thing. Can't do anything special with it. So, you know, maybe a beard was like a compensatory fashion statement. But then I stumbled across this article, right? And according to Hector, he says that beards on humans are there to make your head and your jawline look bigger because that's supposed to make you look like more dominant. So like the same way that an elephant flares its ears or like a cat, like the hairs on the back of its neck stand on end, make it look bigger. And then you've got that daft lizard that's got like a sort of umbrella on its neck that it flaps open. Well, that's what a beard is. It's like a lion's mane. And apparently hats do the same thing. So like Indian warriors and like the Pope and all that. Which makes me think, hang on a minute. So a guy with a top hat, you know, like one of those big stovepipe jobbies. I'm thinking, is he wearing that because it represents his status as an alpha male? And like he's unlike an horse, so he gets to wear one of those big hats? Or is it like he's just trying to compensate for the fact that even if he had sex with a mouse, it'd be like throwing a sausage down a subway tunnel. So instead he's like, well, I better pop this phallic headpiece on and assert my dominance that way. So, you know, is it proof of status or is it faking status? I don't know. Anyway, so they've done studies on this, right? And so this is quoting from Hector's article. In a classic 1973 study, psychologist Robert Pellegrini found that subjects rating pictures of men perceived more facial hair to indicate greater dominance, masculinity, self-confidence, and strength, among other virile traits, leading him to conclude the male beard communicates a heroic image of an independent, sturdy, and resourceful pioneer, ready, willing, and able to do manly things. A number of other studies find that subjects rate men with beards as more aggressive, stronger, more dominant, and having higher social status. Now, this made me laugh because I've got to say, right, and honestly, this happens. So I'll be like walking through the supermarket, and then there'll be another guy in there on one of the other aisles or whatever with a beard. And you know, like when two people are taking the dogs for a walk, and they're both on opposite sides of the road, and the dogs clock each other, and they'll stop and stare at each other, and the owners are like tugging at the lead, and even when the dogs give in and start walking with their owners again, they're still like glaring over the shoulder at each other. That's how guys with beards treat each other in supermarkets. It's like, we don't want to be outbearded. So that certainly backs up the aggression part of the theory. And the other thing that happens, and this does happen a lot, is guys who haven't got beards complimenting guys who have got beards. So I mean, even a couple of weeks ago, where was I now? I think it might have just been at the petrol station. Anyway, the guy behind the counter, it was Burger King. It was the services on the motorway at Burger King. And the guy behind the counter, he's staring at me like I wish girls would stare at me, right? And he goes, "Oh, mate, I've got major beard envy right now." And I've got to say, it's awkward, because it's always like, thanks. But after reading this article, I'm thinking, you know what's going on there, right? His smooth little baldy face, right, all pink and soft like a baby's ass, he's letting me know I'm the boss. I'm the alpha, and he's the beta, right? He's taking the knee. Because think about it, right? He doesn't need to tell me that he's got beard envy, especially using that word, envy. He could just say, nice beard, or he could just keep it to himself. But instead, this beard has given him the illusion that I've got a jawline like Stan Smith from American Dad. So he's looked at me and he's thought, well, he's got a bigger head than me. He's obviously superior in rank and status. And so then he's felt compelled to publicly acknowledge this in front of a queue full of people at Burger King. So, so far so good with the whole dominance theory. But the whole point of this dominance lark is to attract the females, right? Well, let me let you into a horrible little secret, yes? I don't attract the females, right? Having a beard has done nothing to increase the number of occasions where I happen to find myself on the receiving end of women's flirtatious advances. And, I mean, the way guys react, you'd think that every time I walk past a bus stop with a bunch of old ladies sitting there, it'd be like a synchronised version of that scene from Basic Instinct where Sharon Stone's in the interrogation room, but it's not, yeah? So there's a mismatch going on there, because if all the men are sort of throwing themselves to the ground in supplication whenever I go walking through Burger King, like Julius Caesar, surely it should follow that all the women should be throwing themselves at me like some Motley Crue groupies from the 80s, but they don't. So, anyway, go do a little digging, right? I want to find out what's going on here, a bit of research. Turns out, okay, get this. So, there's a bunch of studies showing that women tend to find masculine men more attractive during the ovulation cycle, right? So, there was one study that showed that women who were on the pill when they met the boyfriend, they tended to be in relationships with men who had facial features that were less masculine. And also, apparently, women who are in relationships with men who have feminine features, those women are more likely to lust after other men when they're ovulating, like they're more likely to cheat. But here's the thing, more and more women are using the pill nowadays, so less and less women are ovulating, which means masculine men are becoming less and less, popular. And apparently, some psychologists think that this might be what accounts for the rise of the metrosexual male, and why more and more men are adopting like feminine beauty regimes, like wearing makeup and fake tanning and shaving the body hair and stuff. So I guess the take-home message there is, if you want young boys who work at Burger King to give you awkward compliments in the queue, grow a beard. Yeah? If you want to actually get laid and find a girlfriend, don't grow a beard, shave your legs and your armpits and your arse cheeks, and you might be in with a chance. Actually, I've just thought, Catholics, they don't use the pill, do they? So, that's my Sunday suddenly booked up for the next couple of months. I know, I've got a missus. I need the reassurance, alright? Leave me alone. Right, anyway, my guest today is Dr. Hector Garcia. Hector is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio, and a clinical psychologist at the Veterans Health Administration, specializing in the treatment of combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder. He has published extensively on the treatment of PTSD in combat veterans, masculine identity in the aftermath of war, stress and rank in organisations, and the interplay between religious practice and psychopathology. He's the author of Alpha God, The Psychology of Religious Violence and Oppression, and his TED Talk about training soldiers to return home from combat has racked up over 1 million views. In today's episode, we discuss the evolutionary psychology of warfare, how the combat theatre mirrors the environment of early humans, common causes of PTSD in a military context, and the evolutionary justifications for viewing PTSD as an adaptive survival strategy. We also explore what aspects of the military experience make it difficult for veterans to return to civilian life, what separates veterans who settle back into peacetime environments from those who don't, and, in light of Hector's TED Talk, after training soldiers to go to war, we ask how do we train them to come home again? You can find out more about Hector at his website, which is hector-garcia.com. That's hector-garcia.com. If you're enjoying this podcast and feel it's adding some value to your life or just making your bus rides to work a little bit more tolerable, please do consider supporting it. You can subscribe or donate for as little as £1, which, as I found out today, is less than a medium fries from McDonald's, and I won't make you fat. And they never cook them right anyway. They're always bleeding soggy or dry as a bone. Rip off. So, yeah. myownworstenemy.org/support if you feel so inclined. Anyway, that's enough of me talking bollocks as usual. So, as I always say, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Hector Garcia. Hector Garcia, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Right, before we jump into anything, I've got to say, so your kind of specialities are evolutionary psychology with sort of emphasis on aspects of masculinity and PTSD in a military context. And I've got to say, Hector Garcia is an extremely masculine name. I don't think it's possible. The only more masculine name than Hector Garcia I can think of is Maximus Decimus Meridius. So
that's pretty masculine.
Yeah, that's got to be a chat line of all of its own. That hi, I'm Hector Garcia, like shooting fish in a barrel. So, okay. Before we get into this, as always, if you could tell us a little bit about you, what it is you do, and in particular, why you do it.
Well, my 9-to-5 job is I work at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and it's a job that I've been in for the past 12 years, specializing in providing evidence-based psychotherapy, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in depth, for people suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. In addition to that, I do research on treatment delivery and I write in the field of evolutionary psychology whenever I get a chance. And I do it mainly because I enjoy it. I mean, the clinical work itself is just incredibly gratifying. And I think one of the biggest reasons is because the treatments that we use are so effective. I get veterans who come in really bad shape, and in the end, after about an 8 or 12-week protocol, these guys and girls are going home just in an incredibly better place than they were when they first started.
What was it that steered you towards evolutionary psychology and the military aspect of it as well? What helped that decision, say early on when you first started studying?
Oh, I've always been interested in evolutionary biology and psychology. I think, for me personally, I started with my dad, who was a Darwinist. Back in the 50s, when in America, in Texas, where I live, it's kind of hard to become a Darwinist, but I've always been interested in that science. When 9/11 happened, I was in grad school in New Jersey at Rutgers studying, and it just changed the world. And I had thought for a moment, hey, I want to go join the Marines and go fight. But I thought, well, I've come so far. Let me just stick with what I'm doing and try to give back another way. So I did an internship at a VA, and I love the population. And I think, ever since then, that's where I've been working. I do think there's a lot that evolutionary science has to say about the behavior of warfare and even PTSD. So intellectually, that's a nice combination for me in my research and the talks I give and my thinking.
Have you got any connections, military connections, like in your family? Any history, anything like that?
Sure, I come from a giant Mexican family,
Okay.
so there's a lot of people in my family that are veterans. My dad served in the Navy. He wasn't a war veteran. The timing, just wasn't. He was too young for Vietnam, or too old for Vietnam, and too young for Korea. But back then we had the draft, so everybody went in. But yeah, so that's about it. I haven't served in the military myself.
So you, as part of your work, is working for is it the Department of Veteran Affairs?
That's correct.
So what's your role there, and what's the task of the VA in general?
Well, the VA provides healthcare to veterans, to people who have separated from the military, or often also reservists. So all kinds of healthcare, anything you can imagine. We also have a number of PTSD specialty clinics around the country, and that's what I specialize in. And so I'm a frontline provider. So I see people every day who come in having problems and with PTSD, and I provide the treatments. And like I mentioned in my TED Talk, the treatments are training oriented. So I put my guys and gals through the training.
Well, that's it. So it was seeing your TED Talk that made me contact you, and the theme of that is how to bring soldiers back home after they've served. So we train soldiers up to serve in the military, but then how do we sort of train them up, so to speak, to come back home again? And that's kind of what that's the gravitational center of this conversation. So let's jump into that now. And I'm going to start with, because like I said, we're looking at this from an evolutionary perspective. And the one I'm going to start with is, especially nowadays with the internet and the news and what have you, people have got a window to the world of war, what it actually looks like. It's not just reading it in the newspaper anymore. You can go online and you can see graphic videos and graphic news reports and pictures. And the thing I'm curious about, I guess, is this idea of the motivation to become a soldier and to go to war. For me, knowing those things, despite understanding all the ideas of honour and respect that come with it, and serving your country and just getting a steady job and learning a trade, just that aspect of it, seeing the horrors of war, so to speak, are enough to make me go, hell no, that's not for me. So I'm curious if, from an evolutionary perspective, whether there's an instinctive desire within man, and maybe specifically within men, to become soldiers and to go to war. And if there is, what's the evolutionary or the Darwinian explanation for that?
Right. Well, this is a terrific question, and I'd like to go into kind of a deep dive into the biology of that dynamic you're talking about. So war studies, for example, they focus a lot on surface level phenomena, things like politics, economics, geography, things like this. But what is so often missed is something you just mentioned, and that's the single greatest predictor of human violence of all, and that's being male. So one thing common to men is that we're all biological creatures, and one tool that we can use to understand our own biology is by looking at other species. Now, this can be especially useful when looking at our evolved psychology, because so often it's hidden from our everyday conscious awareness. So leading evolutionary psychologists Lita Cosmides and John Tooby from UC Santa Barbara, they call this instinct blindness. The evolved mechanisms of our mind are usually so old and they're so efficient that they operate seamlessly in the background. So our task, I think, is to bring these these background operations forward so that we can examine them. It's not easy. So I often cite American psychologist William James, who said, I think in the 1800s, 1890, I think, that in order to do this, we need to make the natural seem strange. In other words, all these natural, phenomenon that we're so used to, we need to step back and take the position of an outsider to even see them. And so one thing that I like to do in my writing and in my thinking is consider other animals, because they can help us take that necessary outside perspective. All this being said, to answer your question, I think we need to ask ourselves, what do males of other species fight for? They fight for territory. They fight for what's in territory, the natural resources that territory contains. Then they fight for mates. These are all resources that animals need to survive and to reproduce. So taking this idea forward to humans, fighting for territory seems fairly logical, right? I mean, you just open up a history book and you will have no difficulty seeing how man fights for territory. That maxim that I'm sure you're familiar with, the sun never sets on the British Empire. This is referencing territory, right? Territory that the British Empire controlled. But it was also about the natural resources within. The fertile soils, the food that it created, the precious minerals, the metals, the trade routes, the spice routes, all of this stuff that's relevant to our survival as creatures that need organic resources. And it's not just the British Empire, it's every territorial acquisition that ever took place across history. But how about mates? Other male animals, including primates, fight for mates. But how about men? I want to review some evidence on this, because this idea can be somewhat controversial for those outside the field of fields that are tied to biology. But for one, there's conclusive evidence that violence in men, even out of the context of war, like homicide, armed robbery, assault, things like this, is highly correlated to their sexual peak years. So that age span, about 18 to 27, something around there, is correlated with physical strength. It's correlated with risk taking. It's correlated with high testosterone, which that's a hormone that drives both sex and aggression. And not coincidentally, that is the demographic that militaries recruit. So males of other species fight directly for the right to reproduce, and men are most likely to fight during their sexual peak. Now, this is not uncommon in other species where young males have to be highly aggressive and they have to take risks in order to break into a mating market, so to speak, that's dominated by and monopolized by more powerful males. Now, fascinatingly, research finds that across the globe, revolutions are most common in societies that allow polygyny. Now, think for a moment about what polygyny does. It takes a percentage of available females, reproductive age females, off the mating market. And it skews the ratio of males to available females. So this intensifies demand. And it makes perfect sense that it would intensify violent action or violent rebellion among young men. And again, a lot of this, Danny, happens under the radar of our consciousness. There's so much evidence. We're just covering a small percentage. Archaeological data. Recently in Austria, a 7,000-year-old massacre site was found where, among all the bashed up skulls and bones and spear points and things like that, the archaeologists found a notable absence of skeletal remains from reproductive aged women. And that suggests that the young women in that community, they weren't killed, but they were taken captive. So competing for mates violently goes way back. And let me just be clear about something, Danny, is that all this doesn't mean that men in modern nations such as yours or mine go to war with reproduction as a motive or even sex. However, that is most certainly the case with some groups of men like the men in ISIS or Boko Haram, who are explicitly promised female captives in exchange for taking up jihad. And that's what they do in the process of exterminating their rivals, which are male. They capture females. And it's not limited to Muslims either. The great historian Will Durant talks about how during the Crusades, Christian men were lured to fighting the Crusades with the promises of women as spoils of war. So on the other side, there's even research showing that women find men with facial scars, with light facial scarring, more appealing, and scars suggest a fighting history.
Mm.
Right. There's even research showing that women prefer military men with medals for bravery over those without medals for bravery. So we can study this stuff in the research lab. Part of this concerns the ability to provide protection. But the point is that violence and reproduction are clearly linked in humans, just like any other animal. And just one more thing I want to say about that is that in addition to being based on old reproductive drives, there's also an ancient drive to protect the clan from outsider males who would come in, slaughter all the males in your community, take the females, take over the territory, take over its natural resources, the hunting grounds, the agriculture. And I remember seeing a American World War II campaign poster where the call to arms was a painting of this giant ape holding a bloody club. And over one of his arms, he had this half-naked female kind of just draped over. And he was wearing a German helmet. And underneath that were the words, "Destroy this mad brute, enlist." So whoever designs military recruitment posters, just like ad executives, they understand how reproductive drives compel us to buy or to take up arms and go to war.
Right. So a couple of questions have popped up for me there. Which one am I going to go with first here? Well, the first one is, I guess, so we're talking about kind of very, I'm not sure if this is quite the right word, but very primitive drives for going to war. Like you say, this kind of very Viking idea of, you go and invade this land, and then there's the spoils of war, these things to be taken. But I suppose the question that naturally arises from that is, particularly in, say, Western civilizations, those spoils of war aren't available, are they? It's not that when, someone in the UK or the US signs up to the army, they're not going to be able to go over to a different country. They're not going to be taking land. They're not going to be taking women. There's not going to be spoils of war in that sense. So without that more instinctive drive, I suppose the question sort of still remains, what's the drive there to still go to war, despite there not being those spoils?
I think the hardware kind of gets activated, even though, we're probably, we're not going in and taking land and taking home women, although not modern armies, although you can see this throughout nearly every campaign that's ever been fought. I mean, wartime rape is extremely prevalent. And you see it you saw it in Bosnia, you saw it in the Congo, you saw it in World War II, So I think, it just depends on the conflict. I think, protecting the clan, protecting your homeland. But one thing I know is that when you take young men and you tell them that there's a threat out there, whether the threat is actual or invented or misunderstood, they're going to rally and they're going to fight. And so much of that impulse is based on evolutionary biology and psychology, however sublimated it may be in the modern day, as you said.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. The other one is, because, like you were saying on this poster, this kind of King Kong-esque poster, destroy this mad brute. I was wondering are there any kind of parallels with our kind of closest evolutionary relative, the chimpanzee? Because when you were talking about, say, other species fighting for resources and for mates and stuff, usually that happens, well, as far as I know, from watching David Attenborough documentaries, it's usually like it's a one-on-one thing. It's the alpha male fighting off the beta male, or someone who's trying to take his crown, so to speak. Whereas we do it as a pack, as an army of men together. And so I was just wondering if there was any parallels in the animal kingdom, particularly say with chimpanzees, where like the chimpanzees go to war in the same sense that we kind of do.
Yes and no, and that's a great question. I mean, you're right. A lot of competition for mates is one-on-ones, like as with orangutans or gorillas, things like that. But you do see male coalitionary violence in some animals, like dolphins, and you're right in chimpanzees. Now, if you've ever gotten a chance to watch some of the footage of chimpanzees preparing to conduct patrols, it is eerily familiar. You can counterpoise that with footage of soldiers in Vietnam stalking through the jungle. I mean, the normally boisterous chimpanzees go totally quiet. It's like everybody knows what their mission is. And one by one, in this special cadence reserved for war, they start patrolling through the jungle, single file. They look out above the valleys and get on top of trees so they can spot the enemy. If they see the enemy, well, if they see a smaller party or a lone male, they're calculating the force of the enemy. That's when they attack. If it's a larger force, they retreat. And the attacks are brutal. Stomping, biting, tearing off flesh. A lot of times they go for the testicles, which again eliminates your rivals, your reproductive rivals, right? When you emasculate a rival.
Wow.
And sometimes that way females are recruited, but not usually directly. Now, what has been noted is that chimpanzee troops will go on raids systematically, and eventually through a series of raids, they'll eliminate all the rival males from the nearby chimpanzee troop and absorb all that troop's females into their own. And so they also have greater access to fruit trees and the colobus monkeys, which is a favorite prey animal of chimpanzees, which they just kind of take over. So not in a direct way, in an indirect way, but the same mechanisms are in place. It's a male coalitionary endeavor. And by doing so, those who are successful, they increase their evolutionary fitness. They increase the number of mates that they have access to.
When they conquer even using that word, when they conquer a neighboring tribe of chimpanzees, do they expand the territory as well? Do they absorb the territory?
They absorb the territory. They
Wow.
absorb the territory, everything in it, So fruit trees, the prey animals, space, absolutely. So the parallels are striking, and it's you can really learn a lot about who we are by looking at other species. And that's, sometimes these processes are so hidden from our awareness, like I said, that's what we need. That's what we need to have this mirror into ourselves. We need to look at other animals because it's just too close to us. But I recommend checking out some of those videos. They are eerily familiar.
Yeah, well, I will. I'll dig some up, and I'll include some links in the show notes for people to go and check those out. Okay, so moving on. So we've talked about the motivation and why people still sign up for war. Yeah. And so during our email exchange, because you've got these different specialities of military PTSD and this evolutionary perspective, when we were talking, I was kind of struggling to pull the two together, and I kind of posited the idea of maybe doing separate episodes. But one of the lines that stood out to me in your response was you said that, well, I'll quote you. You've said, I'd argue that the combat theatre mirrors the environment of early humans and turns on an adaptation for a dangerous world. And that, for me, kind of tied the two together. This idea of explaining the psychology of modern warfare and its evolutionary origins. So this idea that the combat theatre of going to war, that mirrors our early environment. I'd like you to kind of elaborate on that and explain what that means, if you could.
Delighted. Sure. So researchers have done massive amounts of number crunching, so to speak, looking at archaeological data, historical data, modern crime statistics, data on homicide and warfare, things like this, and have found that contrary to what many of us believe, we've actually been getting more peaceable as a species. For a great review of this, you can check out Steven Pinker's book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. But that's not what we typically think, because we're also more immersed in information than any time in our history. And so if any kind of violence happens anywhere in the world, we hear about it immediately on the radio. We see it on TV, the internet. We see it. We have it on our phones. And, of course, the media makes their money off selling commercial airtime, and they know that misery sells. So they're gonna bombard the senses with what, the bad things that happen among, in humanity. So things have been improving, but to put this all into perspective, research has found that up to 30% of men and hunter-gatherer tribes will be killed at the hands of other men. Now that is just a stunning number. It's a far higher ratio than we see among U.S. troops, certainly in the recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, for example. I mean, just imagine all 5 boroughs of New York City and wiping out all of Brooklyn. But the take-home message of this is that our brains evolved under extremely violent circumstances, and that we've developed psychological adaptations in order to cope with those threats. And those threats often came in the form of other humans. And especially men among those humans, because men perpetrate, the lion's share of all kinds of violence in the world.
What about? I've got a question swirling around here, but I'm struggling to formulate it. Like say, the combat theatre mirrors the environment of early humans, but early humans were sort of all in it together. Whereas now it's not the same. There's a civilian mentality, and there's a military mentality. And so I guess what I'm interested in is the civilian population. What are they from an evolutionary perspective? Because was there when you're going back to these early tribes, was there anybody that just got to sit on their ass and do nothing all the time while everybody else went off to do the fighting? That's kind of what I'm interested in. It's kind of explaining, are there any evolutionary parallels between this population that just sits at home and doesn't do anything while other men go off to do the fighting?
No. I mean, everybody except for maybe the very old who lived in hunter-gatherer societies, they worked. And the wars were fought close to home or at home. So everybody was impacted by that. They understood it. Cheaters, slackers, hunter-gatherer groups were small enough to be regulated from within. So anybody who did not cooperate risked being ejected from the clan. So in when we were early humans living out on the African savannah, that was a pretty dangerous proposition. If you're by yourself, you face all the ravages of nature, which most of us don't experience in the modern day. And I think in that sense, that is how the combat environment mirrors the environments in which we evolved. I mean, not only dangerous predators, the risk of being killed on the spot by rival by rival humans, especially men. So this idea of being constantly on alert, fearing for your life, bonding closely with other men to get your back if something were to happen. And, when I made that statement, I was primarily speaking to the amount of threat, the constant mortal danger that we faced in that environment.
Yeah, it's got me thinking now that there's try and stay clear a little bit clear of the politics of it, but particularly on the coming from the left, and I don't know if this is the same in America. I think America's takes a little more pride in its military. You're not looking 100% sure on that declaration, but in the UK especially, and especially from the left, there's sort of a distaste, I think, for the military, and there's a weird attitude of people saying that they want to take care of the veterans and the people that are home, but there's not so much support for the people that are actually out there currently fighting, and for people that are proud of being in the military. There's this very strange attitude of it being toxically masculine, and I imagine that attitude, it would not wash in a small tribal society from 10,000 years ago. It's only the fact that the military go out there and protect everybody and give you that privilege to sit on your ass and do nothing and be protected that gives you that privilege to dislike the military in the first place.
I think a very striking difference between then and now is that the motivations for going to war weren't so abstract. It's not for billion-dollar weapons contracts. It's not for oil. It's not for spice routes. It's to prevent the rival clan from slaughtering you, right? It's to fight over a contested resource when you're starving to death, or so that to prevent you from starving to death. And so when you live subject to the ravages of nature like that and other humans, I would say, yes, you're probably right. You do probably appreciate, the warrior clan more than if you don't see a connection to your everyday life, as we probably don't in the modern day in the same way.
It's dangerously close to politics, that one, and we'll stick with psychology. So, okay, bringing the topic of PTSD into the conversation a little bit now. Before we kind of get to the evolutionary purpose, if you like, of PTSD, and I've got a question about whether there is a purpose for it in that actual sense, but I'm just wondering what are some of the most common causes of PTSD for people that have served in the military? And I'm not specifically looking for like gory details, sort of like this injury causes it, that injury causes it, things like that. So one of these papers you sent me, a guy called Chris Cantor, he spoke about these three different types of PTSD, the way they're induced. So predation, conspecific, and environmental. Predation being predatory, so encountering a predator. Conspecific being same species, so human-on-human violence. And then environmental, I'm guessing things like earthquakes and things like that. And I'm wondering if there's any links between those three kinds of PTSD and the experiences that soldiers have out in the field that come to cause PTSD in a military context.
So I don't know that today in the modern day when military forces are out in the combat field fighting, if they risk so much depression, predation or natural disasters, but I think what Cantor was talking about is that those were threats of our evolutionary past that probably shaped the development of PTSD. And I would argue that it's more conspecifics when we look at how we develop PTSD.
Okay, so let me elaborate on that a little bit to try and make sense a little bit more. So the reason I asked is, so I did an episode on PTSD in general. Professor Nick Gray, it's a few episodes ago, so you can go listen to that if you want to hear about PTSD in a more general sense. But one of the interesting things that I stumbled across was this idea of encountering malevolence, and it was almost that the more up close and personal the experience, the more likely it was to cause PTSD. So briefly, for instance, even though, so say something like an earthquake was much less likely to cause PTSD than rape was. Rape had a massive incidence of PTSD because it was an encounter with another person, and it was as up close and personal as it's possible to be. And when I'm talking about the cause of PTSD within a military context, nowadays, mostly I'm guessing, soldiers aren't running up on each other and battling the same way that they used to do, say, on horseback 150 years ago. It's warfare from a distance, and I'm wondering if that idea of PTSD induced by an encounter with another human being is less likely now with modern warfare. And say, even though it's not quite the same, I was wondering if when you've got a soldier sort of who's patrolling and he doesn't encounter anybody, but he stands on a landmine, whether that's because it's not an encounter with another person, whether that feels like, and is that similar to an environmental occurrence of an injury, and then trying to pulling it all together. So, a soldier's more likely to get PTSD from hand-to-hand combat than they are from, say, stepping on a landmine. I hope that makes sense.
It does make sense. Now, I could talk a lot about this question, and I heard the interview with Nick Gray, and the question was, why does rape or physical assault result in greater PTSD than natural disasters or motor vehicle accidents? And so I think he was right about proximity, right? So there's even research looking at, okay, if you're engaging in combat and you're talking about a sniper at, a mile away, you may be less likely to have PTSD with those kinds of, engagements as opposed to hand-to-hand combat. You can't get more up close and personal than rape. But I think it's also about what were the most prevalent dangers of our evolutionary past. It wasn't cars, it wasn't natural disasters, it was threats from other humans. So we have a predisposition, a tendency to fear those threats of our evolutionary past more. So, for example, when you look at the incidence of phobias, specific phobias, people are far more likely to develop phobias of snakes. They're more likely to develop phobias of spiders or heights. All of these things were threats to our ancestors. Even people living in New York City, for example, who may never encounter a poisonous snake in their life, as opposed to things that really have a much higher likelihood of getting you killed, such as, crossing the street in New York City. So I think when the threats involve other humans, that lights up the brain in a certain way that makes it more traumatic because of those reasons. So there's even a reference that I've written about by a biologist named John Byers, who was talking about American pronghorn. These animals are the fastest land animals in North America. They can run over 60 miles per hour. How do they get that way? Well, they were once chased by predators, by cheetahs. Also the fastest land animal. So even though those cheetahs in North America anyway are extinct, how he put it was these pronghorns are haunted by the ghosts of predators past. And I love how he put that. So we are as well, and what we're haunted by is the threat from other humans in many cases. And I think that's one of the reasons why, physical assault probably results in worse PTSD than, say, an earthquake or, a flood. because our brain is prepared to be wary of other humans more than floods or earthquakes, because that was the most prominent threat in our evolutionary past.
Mm. Yeah, the other one as well is, again, it's probably more like a philosophical question, this one, but this idea of predation and facing up against a predator, it kind of, when I was reading one of the papers of yours that you sent me, you're talking about things like xenophobia and how there's a tendency to kind of dehumanize the enemy, to call them pigs and dogs and monsters and things like that. And I was just wondering if, I don't know, it seems like maybe just a philosophical level that with that dehumanization, maybe part of the psychology of it is that you don't see the enemy as another human being, that you do see him as an animal, as a predator, and that makes it, well, easier to kill them.
Absolutely. There's a psychologist named David Grossman. He was a military psychologist and a lieutenant colonel in the Army who wrote this book called On Killing, which talks about the psychological costs of killing in warfare. And he really develops this idea that you're talking about, where, most species have a natural kind of mental brakes function on violence that's intraspecies, and that may have helped us to form coalitions. I mean, if we were inclined to kill our tribe mates at the first slight, we wouldn't be that effective out on the savannas. And so in order to overcome that, we have to go to sometimes to certain lengths to see the enemy as not one of us, is not human. It's called infrahumanization. They're pigs, they're dogs, they're monkeys, they're monsters. And when you really think about it, that ties into this idea of the selfish gene that Richard Dawkins popularized in his book with that same title, The Selfish Gene, which points out that, individuals aren't really the units of selection. Genes are. So, we have a tendency. A good way to explain this is by looking at acts of altruism. If I'm going to run into a burning building and save somebody, my willingness to do so is going to be directly proportional to how much genetic material I have in common with that person. I'm going to save my child first, right? And maybe a distant stranger next. And, I might leave my pet in there to burn rather than save myself, than put myself at risk to save my goldfish, for example. But what we're doing when we're infrahumanizing is saying, actually, I don't share DNA in common with you, right? We have no DNA in common. You're an animal. You're so far from this genetic bond that ties us all in together as brothers in arms, so to speak, that killing you is not a big deal.
Yeah, again, well, like you said then, with this idea of brothers in arms, another thing you mentioned in the paper, this use of language is, whereas you call the enemy pigs and dogs to kind of dehumanize them, even though soldiers nowadays, there isn't that literal familial bond. So in a tribal society, everyone was related. But nowadays, people come from all over different parts of the country. They've never met each other before, but they become brothers in arms and they fight for the motherland or the fatherland. And I just thought that contrasting use of language is fascinating.
Yeah, it's kind of a linguistic device to suggest greater genetic relatedness than people actually share. Because you're right. I mean, it doesn't take a huge amount of motivation to save somebody that you have genes in common with, because if I get killed, at least, if I'm saving my brother, I have 50% of my genes live on through him. So sure. And you hear of people in leadership in the military talking about their boys, really feel strong paternalistic feelings towards the young men who are under them. And all this again is based on genetics and the impact of genetics on how we think and how we form bonds and how we break bonds and how we fight.
Yeah. Okay, so coming back to this idea of, say, the causes of PTSD, one of the things I was wondering is whether for a soldier to come home with what would be classed as PTSD, does there need to be? No, not does there need to be. Does there tend to be that it was a specific horrific incident that causes it, or can it just be the general experience of war without a specific incident?
It's for, according to the DSM, the diagnostic manual we use to arrive at a psychiatric diagnosis. There has to be a specific event, and I think Nick Gray, was that his name? Gray?
Nick Gray, yeah.
Yeah, I think he does a pretty good job of describing the criteria for a trauma in that podcast. He does a good job of that. But so, it has to be a specific event. It can be combat. It's often combat, not always people in direct combat. You can be on base during a mortar or rocket attack, and that's often very traumatic because death is all around you. And what's especially traumatic about that is you don't have control. There's no enemy to target. There's no way to retaliate. You're just there, a sitting duck, basically. If you're a medic working in a field hospital, for example, where you see a high number of deaths and horrific injuries, that can be traumatic. Sometimes you're treating these people in the process of being mortared. So you're getting kind of a compounded form of trauma in those cases. Military sexual trauma, rape. I treat a lot of vets who've experienced that. And, most commonly in the military, at least in the U.S., it's most commonly men on men. And I think probably at this point due to the high percentage of men in the military. But even things like training accidents. I've worked with a number of people, for example, who saw their buddies get killed during live fire exercises. So, there's a lot of things. It doesn't necessarily have to be direct combat, but we are talking about something specific where you witnessed, death, or there was a legitimate threat of death, or perceived threat of death, or injury, things like that.
Is there anything psychologically that seems to separate soldiers who present with PTSD to those that don't? Because I believe it's a minority of people come back from war presenting with PTSD and trauma. So I'm just wondering if there's any kind of common identified factors that separate those that tend to become traumatized from those that don't.
We're trying to figure this out, and PTSD is something we didn't know very much about up until the 1980s when research on PTSD really began taking off. We didn't even actually have a formal diagnosis of PTSD until 1980, at least in the U.S. and the DSM. So we're still trying to figure that out. I have colleagues here in San Antonio who are looking for genetic markers. There are people who have found, there are researchers who have found that there are epigenetic markers. In other words, if your parents have experienced a trauma, that's more likely to turn on genes in you that makes it more likely that you're going to develop PTSD. And that speaks to the adaptability of PTSD, and that also suggests that, hey, the environments of our ancestors were dangerous across generations, right? So for that to be useful, for me to experience a trauma, it turns on a gene in me that gets passed on to you. That's speaking to pretty pervasive danger in our environments. So it's hard to predict. I mean, the length and intensity of the trauma. And one thing that I don't believe is talked about enough is trauma prior to the military. That is a predictor of PTSD. It's actually a predictor of suicide up and above and beyond combat experience. So having come from a family that was abusive, physical abuse, sexual abuse, that makes you more likely to develop PTSD in response to a military-related trauma. Now, the unfortunate thing is that there's a certain population of people who join the military specifically to get away from those situations. So people who are trying to get away from their fraught home life join the military, and in the process, they experience greater trauma. So,
do you think maybe things like, I'm trying to think of a better word, but maybe things like naivety play a role, in the sense that maybe people don't know what they're signing up for? You know, it's only once you get out there in the field, and because the ad, I've got to say, Hector, the adverts look great. Do you know what I mean? For joining the army, they look fantastic. But then I think when you're out there in the field and the bullets are whizzing over your head and people are being blown to pieces around you, if you didn't go into that situation expecting that to be the case, I don't know, maybe that plays a role.
It's hard to say whether, that empirically, whether that, being naive going into it would make you more likely to develop PTSD, but I certainly hear that talked about. A lot of people join the military at 17 years old. They get special permission from their parents to join at 17, and you're a kid at 17. And what do you know? If you do think of it as, it's all the glory and the camaraderie, and then the reality of what you're going into sets in on the battlefield, and it can be a shock, definitely.
So again, bringing the evolutionary perspective into the concept of PTSD, what is the evolutionary perspective on PTSD, of whether it's an adaptive survival strategy or whether it's kind of just pure biological overwhelm that just messes you up, if you like?
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned before, Chris Cantor, who I believe calls himself an evolutionary psychiatrist, he's out of Australia. He has most fully developed this idea in one of his books. So here, how I'd like to answer that question is to outline a few of the symptom clusters of PTSD and explain how each of these is surmised to present a survival advantage. So one cluster is what we call re-experiencing symptoms. So this is, you get memories of the event, you get bad dreams related to the event, or you see some kind of reminder in your environment, and that brings the experience back. But it's not a pleasant experience. The adrenaline goes way up. The emotions feel really raw and painful, as if the event had just happened. So what Cantor argues is that this experience helps us keep dangerous, potentially life-saving information constantly in the foreground so that we never forget it. And when you think about it, you really don't want to forget danger information. So if when I was hunting in the forest, I walked by a particular cave entrance, and a cave bear rushed out and nearly mauled me to death, I want to be sure that I remember that cave, that section of the woods, to keep me from putting myself in mortal danger again. And this idea is in keeping with what we know about how animals learn. Animals learn information, including humans. We learn danger information very quickly, and we forget it very slowly. When you think about it, that makes perfect sense, because animals who forgot danger information very quickly would very quickly get weeded from the gene pool.
Yeah, so like the caveman that walks past one cave, gets attacked by a bear but survives, and then just carries on walking and sees another cave and just thinks, I'll be fine. He got weeded out of the gene pool.
He's going to end up in the stomach of that bear, and along with the traits coding for not remembering.
Sorry, Hector, I think that even though I was sort of being facetious against our ancestors there, I think there's a point worth maybe expanding on a little bit there. So when you were talking about, say, you go past this cave and you're attacked by the bear, and then you remember that incident, but I'm guessing you remember it in a more abstract sense. So it's not just the trauma doesn't become attached to just that cave and that bear. It'll become attached to caves and bears in a more abstract sense. Is that the case?
Sure. So false positives are safer than false negatives, right?
Right.
So yeah, you're absolutely right. So the fear will generalize to other similar stimuli. So another symptom is avoidance, and that's pretty face valid. So many people with PTSD avoid reminders, situations, places that are related to the trauma or even, distally related to the trauma. Crowds, So like you said, it's not hard to see how avoiding certain kinds of environments would provide a survival advantage in a dangerous environment. And peacetime, that can be problematic because you're not participating in family life. It's harder to participate in, school or professional life if you're avoiding people or places. Emotional numbing is another symptom too. Many of my patients complain that they can't feel. They can't feel emotions. They go to someone's funeral that's close to them and they can't cry. They can't show emotion. And that hurts them in a peacetime environment where you need to experience, you need to demonstrate emotions to be in functioning relationships.
Now, is that say purely that PTSD has kind of destroying the emotions, or is it the case that, say, particularly in a military context, it's just that when you've been out on the battlefield and you've experienced super extreme emotions, that coming back to a civilian environment, the incidents don't evoke the same kind of emotional response? Does that make sense?
Yes. I see what you're saying, and I think what you're talking about is, the thrill of combat, the adrenaline rush, the intense meaning of everything that you do. I mean, if you take an 18-year-old kid and you put him in charge of or 20-year-old kid, you put him in charge of a platoon full of men and millions of dollars worth of military equipment, and every choice that he makes has incredible impact. And then you put him back in the civilian world where, he has a job that's, I mean, how can you match that in terms of meaning and intensity? Mm. So some people have a difficult time readjusting to civilian life for that kind of reason. But what I'm speaking about is more of a strategy that allows you to perform under dangerous circumstances, which a lot of times, military folks are trained to do that. So, for example, in theater, it pays to cut off your emotions because your life may depend on it. Everybody else's life may depend on it as well. So, one thing I encounter, for example, and I won't tell the gory details, but a lot of my guys talk about how in a firefight, a kid or a woman will pick up an RPG and get ready to fire it at them. And, this may tap into what you were talking about earlier about the emotional brakes on violence, especially when it involves women or children. But whatever sympathy they have to cut that off. They have to cut that off to take out that target, because if they don't, they're not going to survive it. And neither is all the buddies around them who risk getting blown to pieces by that rocket-propelled grenade. As one example, if you're a medic attending to a severe arterial bleed, you got to keep your cool. You can't panic, or whoever you're working on is not going to survive. So it's one of those cases where in theater, these symptoms serve you. When you come back and you don't revert back to how you were, then it no longer serves you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I guess there seems to be a sort of contradiction for the argument of PTSD being adaptive, in that it seems counterproductive that the very this very thing. So PTSD is designed to reduce the future suffering of the organism, but at the same time, it's causing suffering. It's causing flashbacks and nightmares. So it seems contradictory that this protective mechanism is itself causing the organism to suffer. And I'm just wondering how we kind of reconcile that.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. That's a good question. And I think that's a point that is commonly misunderstood. So one way to look at this is that adaptations are not actually geared towards reducing suffering. They're geared towards ensuring survival, and that's different because I think it's fair to say that the phenomenology, the experience of suffering, is in fact a survival adaptation. In other words, if you suffer from hunger, that's going to motivate you to forage or hunt. If you're suffering from cold, you're going to seek shelter. If you're feeling a burning sensation on your hand, which is uncomfortable, it's suffering, you're going to pull your hand out of the fire. So suffering actually serves survival in that sense. And it's interesting because a lot of the clinical sequelae or the symptoms that we experience as a product of a disease process are there for a purpose. And this is something that evolutionary medicine tends to highlight. For example, when we vomit, when we have diarrhea, something like that, it serves a purpose. It's unpleasant, but it rids our digestive system of harmful pathogens. When we get a fever, it cooks those pathogens inside us. So in that sense, that kind of even with psychopathology, while it causes personal distress, it's based on adaptations designed to keep us alive. So one way to look at it is what Steven Pinker has written, that nature isn't necessarily nice, right? Doesn't really care if you suffer or not, and it's just geared towards making sure you survive long enough to reproduce yourself into future generations or your genes.
Yeah, wow, that's interesting. Never really thought about it. It's made me think about my own the shit that I've got going on is this. Yeah, I just like that analogy between the suffering is the very thing that helps you survive and figure things out. It's equally enlightening and upsetting, I guess, to sort of hear that.
Another example of this is seasonal depression, or what is known as seasonal affective disorder. So when winter comes, many of us experience depression, right? Our energy goes down, our motivation to do things just plummets. We don't go outside. And for many of us, we start craving high fat, high sugary foods. We binge. So the subjective experience of seasonal depression is unpleasant, but wintertime for a significant part of our evolution has been associated with scarcity, with scarce resources. So in that environment, it actually makes sense to conserve as much energy as possible. Low motivation helps this. And it makes sense to consume as many calories as possible to conserve energy. It's a kind of hibernation response. Low motivation may have even, kept us from going out into dangerous weather that could possibly kill us. So needless to say, most of us who live in northern latitudes where it gets cold into winter, now we have access to food. Now we have access to central heating. We're not living off the land. So we have access to grocery stores, McDonald's, but these appurtenances of modern day living have only come about in an eye blink of our evolutionary history. We still house these Stone Age brains calibrated for that environment.
Yeah, this is phylogenetic mismatch, I think. Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's a good way for people to not necessarily kind of befriend their afflictions, but just to be, I suppose it's a good, seeing it that way helps you be a little less hard on yourself if you're going through anything like this, I guess. One thing that's just sort of, that came up then, which I definitely think is worth asking. So when you were talking about some soldiers mentioning these scenarios where they have to engage with a woman or a child. I've read somewhere that another cause of PTSD, which we didn't cover with Nick, is this, and especially in a military context, is people can get PTSD from things that they have done as opposed to just things that have happened to them. So firstly, if that's the case, one, I'd like you to sort of expand on that a little bit, but also I'm very curious as to the evolutionary purpose of that response.
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. I think it probably taps more into what we were talking about earlier with David Grossman's book and the idea that we may have to overcome some hurdles to kill other people, psychological hurdles, and not only that, but like you said earlier, it's only a small percentage of people who experience traumas that actually go on to develop PTSD. So Grossman argues again, and I agree with him, that we have this brakes mechanism for hurting or harming people or organisms that come from that are our own species. I think that there's probably a mechanism where you're going against that. So there's competing mechanisms, right? So when you take someone else's life, that's probably going counter to an evolved adaptation designed to cooperate with other humans, to interact with them, to engage with them. And there's probably people who differ along the natural curve on that. Some people are super compassionate, some people aren't. And that probably impacts the experience of those kinds of acts in theater. So the sociopath, the person who just has a pathological lack of compassion, that person's not going to experience that, but that's on the tail end of the natural curve of, compassion. So, that's a great question. I'm not sure if I've really done it justice, but I think natural selection isn't it's usually not incredibly specific, because if it's incredibly specific, it can't roll with the environmental punches, so to speak. And so there's variation among all of us. Not everybody will experience trauma when they do things to other people. Some people will. It kind of depends on their own personalities, which varies naturally by way of natural selection.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if maybe it's got something to do with maybe struggling to square the person you feel you are fundamentally with the things that you've done. So if you were just kind of raised, a nice, polite kid in a small town with a loving family, and a regular education, maybe had yourself a girlfriend and just a regular, nice, quiet life. And then you find yourself in a situation where you're forced to carry out things that are way outside the bounds of your understanding of yourself, that maybe that's got something to do with it. I don't know. I'm talking bollocks, Hector, just speculating, but I don't know.
No, right. I think you're right. I think there's cognitive processes involved, and I keep plugging Grossman's book, but he makes a really interesting point, and that is kind of tapping into what you're saying. So combat is a totally different sphere of morality than civilian life, right? In civilian life, we're taught thou shall not kill if you're a Christian, right? Even if you're not, I mean, that's something we learn, You're taught that women and children are to be nurtured and cherished, right? In combat, it's fair game. Women and children are combatants. You're supposed to kill. And so the problem I help people deal with sometimes is when they're using the rules of the other moral universe, the civilian moral universe, to judge what they do in theater, right? And that's not a fair set of criteria, because in theater it is okay to kill, and you have to kill women and children sometimes, and you have to do things that in the other world would be considered incredibly immoral and illegal. and just morally repugnant. So judging yourself based on the rules of the combat theater, not the other set of rules, and it can be a challenge. But like you said, absolutely, prior learning, prior values, I think that comes to play, especially when taking life.
Well, I think actually this is sort of a good segue into moving into this idea of bringing soldiers home now. And this is sort of centered around your TED Talk as well, which was, after hearing the TED Talk, it seems like a blatantly obvious problem. But I've got to say, it hadn't occurred to me until I heard you talk about it, that we train people to go and fight, but we don't train them to come home. And like I say, it seems blatantly obvious, but it never occurred to me. So if we could kind of delve into that now, I'm interested specifically in what is it about the military experience that makes it difficult? And we've kind of touched upon a few things, but to go a little deeper on it now, what is it about the military experience that makes it difficult for some soldiers to return to civilian life?
There are so many things, and there's so many ways I could answer this question. I think one thing that I find really interesting is the closeness that people feel. That's one thing. War correspondent Sebastian Junger recently put out a book called Tribe, where he argues that, and I agree with him, that the combat experience emulates the ancestral tribe. In tribal societies, you hunted, you fished, you ate, you slept side by side with your tribe mates, and you went to war shoulder to shoulder with those same men, and you came back with those same men. That can awaken with high emotional valence, this intuitive, tribalistic psychology that we have. For example, during World War II, when the Germans were bombing London, people slept together in the tube, and they endured these incredibly harsh and devastating experiences. Despite this, after the war, many Londoners reported missing those days. And that's just an absolutely absurd thing to say if you don't understand what's happening. There. We evolved in close-knit groups of people who united to face the harsh realities of hunter-gatherer lifestyles, where there were constant dangers. So those kinds of circumstances are emotionally intuitive. And so when you go off to combat, that connection awakens with the force. That ancient hardware comes alive. But the problem happens when you get back and everybody disperses. In the U.S., one guy maybe goes to Texas, the other guy to California, the other guy Florida, whatever, and you go back to living your individualist, containerized lifestyles. That's the evolutionary mismatch. We didn't evolve living the way we live today. And there's even research showing that PTSD is associated with affluence. So, in other words, the more, not the less affluent you are, the more isolated kind of lifestyle you tend to live. And where you're not surrounded by people engaged in this shared struggle to survive that unites us so closely. And the clinical literature is pretty clear on this, where one of the biggest buffers to a number of psychiatric conditions is having a social support system. And when you really peel it apart, when you peel it back, that social support ties back to the ways that we once lived. So that's one factor among many.
So that's you talked about this in your paper about how veterans will try, when they come home from war, they'll try to recreate these brotherhoods in various ways, or to kind of keep the military experience going. So they'll wear the same insignia, they've got bumper stickers, or they join motorcycle gangs and things like that.
Right.
Well, actually, before we move on to any of the others, this idea of trust, the trust and the bond that happens between soldiers. Obviously, when they're out there in the battlefield, they have to trust one another with their lives, quite literally. And one of the things I thought was quite interesting was this idea of when they come back to civilian life, there can be this feeling that not only that civilians aren't trustworthy, but it's that kind of what's that saying that you often hear, and I think your paper's named after it, like you don't know you weren't there, that kind of attitude towards civilian life, and that civilians can seem very undisciplined. Yeah, if you could expand on that from that perspective, why someone that's been in the military can return to civilian life and look around them, and because it seems counterintuitive to think that somebody goes away to war, there's all this chaos and violence, and then they come back to peacetime, and it's like, well, surely you should just be able to, chill out now, relax, everything's fine. And why doesn't that happen?
Yeah, some people can. A lot of people can't. And what you're talking about is one of the reasons that is one of the things that makes reintegration problematic. It kind of makes sense just looking at it from the perspective that, well, when you're with other men in a combat situation, all these other men are daily proving to you that they're gonna get your back, that they're gonna put their life on the line to protect you, and you do the same for them. It's again, this kind of taps into these ancient evolved psychological mechanisms that were designed to help people cooperate. But you come back and nobody is going out of their way to show you that level of commitment. So just by sheer contrast, it feels like I can't trust anybody because nobody's showing you those commitments. But the thing is, they don't have to, because day-to-day life in the civilian world doesn't involve mortal threat nearly to the extent that it does in a combat theater. So, that's one kind of calibration that gets stuck in the world of combat that needs recalibrating. The discipline, that really bothers people. In the military, things are done with military precision. Things are done a certain way, and they have to be, because one slip up or being sloppy about how you do something can result in somebody's death pretty easily. Here, in most cases, it doesn't need to be. So even benign things that don't really have a huge impact on one's survival, if they're not done with military precision, it rubs people wrong just because of what it meant in a combat theater.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, though, especially this idea of trust. It's in a very modern sense. It seems, well, I'm a civilian. Of course, I'm trustworthy. We live in a modern society where everything's safe or whatever. But yeah, from an evolutionary perspective, you haven't earned the trust, which, and that's, so this idea of costly signaling, and I love this concept, and but again, it doesn't make sense until you think about it from an evolutionary perspective. So if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, costly signaling. It explains quite a lot, doesn't it? I mean, this is the idea that humans have developed a way to communicate with non-kin by demonstrating a costly signal of commitment. And we talked earlier about how, it's easier to cooperate with kin because you share genetic material. But with non-kin, you have to, what humans have done is in order to cooperate with people who aren't their blood relatives, they developed costly signals to show their commitment. And in that way, they avoid cheaters on the cooperative exchange, as it were, which can be dangerous. So imagine, if you're a hunter-gatherer, you share your quarry with somebody who, when he goes hunting and kills an animal, he scarfs it up all by himself in secrecy. You're spending a lot of time and energy supporting somebody who's not giving back, or even more poignantly, putting yourself on the line in war for somebody who runs when the arrows start flying or the missiles start flying. So the idea is that if the commitment is costly, if the signal of commitment is costly, then the less likely somebody is to fake cooperation in order to take advantage of you. So anthropologist Richard Sosis categorized these signals into what he calls the 3 Bs. And I really like this because it's explanatory. Behaviors, bands, and badges. So behaviors like long, exhausting rituals, certain taboos like not eating certain foods or not turning on your electricity on a certain day, or badges of commitment, things that are hard to fake. So a lot of hunter-gatherer tribes, for example, go through ritualistic scarring, for example, to show their commitment. If you're going to go through all that pain of scarring yourself, it's probably a good bet that you're not faking your level of commitment to the group and to me as a person who's going to put myself on the line for you. And these kinds of practices are concentrated among men. So just going through basic training is a rite of passage in the military. Grueling training regimens, extremely harsh or painful qualification procedures, such like you see in elite forces like the Navy SEALs or the Army Rangers or the Royal Marines, for example. Each of those hurdles stands as a signal of commitment. And in the military, many of these hurdles come with actual insignia, actual badges showing what you have done. So these things have great importance on the fields of combat, just as they would the savannas of Africa. And again, when you come home, you don't see these guarantees of commitment being broadcast as much. And part of this is just related to, we live in these enormous societies where you can encounter somebody on the street and you're never going to encounter them again, so it's impersonal. And there's less of a need to show these levels of commitment, and that can just feel vacuous to people when they first come back.
Yeah, and finally, one that I thought was very sort of opposite at the moment with these. I don't know if it's the same over in the US, but there's a lot of kind of mental health anti-stigma campaigns that are being directed towards men at the moment, and this idea of, it's okay to talk, and I think there's a sort of an emasculation effort. There's an undertone of that anyway to it, and this idea of men not showing emotions, it's just silly, you should just learn, just get over it, kind of thing, and the concept of being a man, it's very fluid, and we need to get over these ideas of what constitute masculinity. But here, there's some very convincing arguments about masculinity and why emotional suppression is valuable from an evolutionary perspective. So, right. Yeah, again, if you could just expand on that.
Well, like we were talking about, it's useful to be able to contain emotion when you're in a dangerous situation. But not only that, the ability to do so stands as a badge of commitment. You try to not show fear so that other people will have confidence in you to perform your job under incredibly stressful situations. So I think you're right on the money there. Anti-stigma campaigns are valuable and needed. If you're framing this just as silly machismo, you're going to lose the people you're talking to, because it's far, far more than that. It's far more meaningful. It's far more practical and more ancient than that. Understanding the purpose of that, putting it into that context, clinically, just explaining this, I've gotten a lot of good use out of it. I mean, when you explain the purpose of all this, the purpose of suppressing emotion, how it serves you there but doesn't serve you here, that resonates with the people I treat. They understand that, and they're far more likely to listen to you when you frame it that way than when you frame it as silly machismo, so to speak.
So, but why? That's it. But why is So for people that are saying that, you know, that do think that men should just talk, it's fine, you know, it's show your emotions, it's fine, blah blah blah. What is the evolutionary advantage of suppressing emotions, and particularly in a combat context?
Well, we talked about some of them, you know, being able to perform under high stress. I mean, that's huge. You know, you have to be able to, if you're treating a badly injured comrade and you start freaking out, that guy's going to die, you know. And other scholars have also surmised that, you know, you want to you don't want to give signals to the enemy too. So we you know, evolved fighting up close and personal, hand to hand, much close, like you mentioned, much closer than we fight now. So some scholars have suggested, you know, part of the purpose of containing emotions is so that you don't give an advantage to your foe who's seeing your face. If you show fear or hesitation, that person's going to use that to your advantage. So there's all kinds of reasons. And again, this taps into a long history living very differently than most of us live today. And I just think a lot of people don't understand these evolved mechanisms. It's you know, what we're talking about today is kind of a niche field that I think should have a greater voice in the conversation about who we are, about how we handle things clinically, such as PTSD. It has a lot of utility. It has a lot of explanatory power.
Yeah, there's something, this particular aspect of particularly anti-stigma campaigns, something I feel strongly about, because I feel that there's an attitude of if you want to be treated for whatever your mental health issues are, then you have to leave your masculinity at the door, and then you're being welcomed into the therapeutic context. But for me, I think it's important to be able to treat people and keep that sense of masculinity intact, for guys to be able to go into therapy and not feel okay about expressing their emotions, and to feel awkward about it, and to feel that it's a bit girly or whatever, and that it's not manly, but for that to be all right, and not to politicize it, and to work from there, not to feel that needs to be gotten rid of first. I mean, I don't know if you agree with that, but that's certainly my opinion anyway.
Oh, it certainly, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you want to lose somebody, that's how you lose them, you know. Not seeing the purpose of that, then you're just kind of this mushy therapist that doesn't really understand. That contributes to this idea that how could you help me? You weren't there. You can't understand it. You're just you know, you're just trying to tell me to be all mushy and emotional.
Yeah, there's two sentences from your paper which stood out to me. One is, while having taken a beating by social scientists studying gender role norms, male stoicism can mean the difference between life and death. Novice clinicians or even family members may make the mistake of trivializing emotional control or politicizing it by framing it solely as machismo. And yeah, like I say, I just think that to understand this from an evolutionary perspective is just appreciate the hurdle that guys are trying to overcome when it comes to talking about these things. You know, it's not a case of just spit it out and get over it. It's so deep seated. I mean, to this day for me, telling somebody that I have anxiety, that I've had an anxiety, it just every time it makes me cringe to say it, and it's always uncomfortable. But yeah, and the thing is, Hector, I don't know that I want to get over that. Do you know what I mean? It's part of my identity that I feel that way about it.
And it certainly has different implications for men than for women. And it's not just acculturation, right? It's acculturation based on these evolutionary mechanisms.
Yeah.
But the more we understand them, I think the more effective we can be in the clinical world in situations like this.
Okay, so bearing all this in mind, what's the prescription for bringing veterans home and reintegrating them into society in a successful manner?
Well, many are going to reintegrate just fine on their own. Some won't. But what I really want your listeners to know is about evidence-based psychotherapies. We used to think that PTSD wasn't treatable. We used to think that you had to live with the disorder for your entire lifetime. We now know that that is not the case. Many of the people that I treat and many of the people that my colleagues treat across the entire VA system, by the time they're done with treatment, they don't meet criteria for the disorder and they don't relapse. That's not everybody, but a huge percentage. And the two most studied treatments are called prolonged exposure therapy and cognitive processing therapy. And prolonged exposure therapy, it involves going over your traumatic memories over and over and over. And so what happens is you habituate to them. What starts out as being, very anxiety provoking, you listen to it, the adrenaline goes up, the emotions feel intense. But every time you hear this recording of yourself narrating the trauma, it goes down a little bit and then a little bit more. And until that memory doesn't generate that response anymore. And this is not like erasing a memory like I've talked about in other venues. That can't be a goal of treatment because we can't excise specific memories from someone's mind on a certain day at a certain time, but you do get to the point where it just doesn't shoot you with a giant surge of adrenaline anymore. And you don't have to spend all this mental energy trying not to think about it anymore. You're just fine with it. It doesn't mean that you stop caring about what happened if what happened was that you lost a comrade. It just means it doesn't feel like it just happened anymore. Another part of this treatment is going into situations or places that cause anxiety. You do it over and over and over until the fear response extinguishes. So it's kind of like a field training. So, I have my guys, we design a plan for them, a protocol to follow. It's almost like you're going to the gym. Today I went to this store and I stayed for this amount of time, and you write down what you did. You write down your anxiety, just like if you're going to the gym and marking down how many sets you did. You do it the next day. It's all very formulaic, and you can see your anxiety going down. So by the end of 8 weeks, I've worked with guys who could not leave their house, and by the end of the treatment, they're taking their wives, their girlfriends, their friends to concerts with thousands of screaming fans around them, and they're fine. It's field work, it's training, it's repetition. And the good thing about working with military people is they understand training. They understand it has to be repetitive until it becomes muscle memory. Now, the other treatment, if I may just talk a little bit about that, is cognitive therapy. And cognitive therapy is based on the understanding that how we see things, how we interpret things affects how we feel. So whatever emotion you have, whether it's panic or sadness or guilt, a thought precedes that. Sometimes those thoughts can get stuck on the prior environment. And because they're stuck on the prior environment, they're not accurate for a civilian life, for example. So what we do is we train people to recognize their thinking. That takes a little practice because our thought processes are incredibly fast, and oftentimes we're not aware of what we're thinking. But we train people to recognize what appraisals they're making of going to a restaurant, of sitting with their back to the door, of getting emotionally close to people, whatever it is. And we test their thinking to see if it's actually accurate for the here and now. And if it's not, we systematically, through doing worksheets where you come up with a more accurate thought about whatever situation you're dealing with, until your cognitions change, until you develop more realistic thought patterns. And again, you do this over and over. And this one is an amazing treatment as well. You're able to develop the perspective of an outsider, the objectivity of an outsider looking in at your thoughts before you respond to a situation. They're both highly effective. For your listeners, ask for these by name. I cannot stress that enough. It's just like a medication. These treatments have gone through research trials over and over and over that shows they're effective. Now that's not something that's usually thought about when regarding psychotherapies. It's usually thought about when we're talking pharmacotherapy. But if you're going to do a therapy, you want to know that it's been proven effective. And these two treatments have endured the test of time. They work. I've seen it work a million times. The data says it works. And that's the most important thing. Repeated, studies have shown, placebo-controlled trials have shown over and over and over that they work in reducing PTSD. So go get the treatments.
Just quickly, so there's another two that I'd just quickly like your opinion on. So one is EFT, emotional freedom technique, the tapping. Now that's people have it seems to be the practitioners of this that speak very highly of it and say that it helps with trauma. But the other one, more interestingly, is EMDR, so eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. That seems to be quite highly lauded by people that have actually had PTSD. So I'm just quickly wondering what you think of those two.
Well, I do have an opinion about those two.
Yeah.
Well, the EFT, let me tell you, I've never actually heard of that. I read in your blog somebody said that was being rolled out at VA. I've never heard of that. I don't know what that is, but unless it stood the test of time through repeated trials, I wouldn't do it, and I don't know if that one has or hasn't. I know nothing about it. But you're right. Just because a clinician praises a certain treatment and swears it works, sometimes that happens and you put it to empirical testing and it doesn't work. Now, the thing about EMDR, I'm glad you asked about this. So EMDR involves, among other things, recounting aspects of the trauma like you would in prolonged exposure therapy. But it also involves, doing these lateral movements, either, tapping your left and right hand repeatedly or looking at a metronome or a light or something like that. And the idea is that's supposed to unlock something in your brain by talking to the two hemispheres in some way. I don't recall exactly how the argument was framed, but I tell you, when we've done dismantling studies, and by we I mean the scientific community that looked at all the different facets of EMDR, and they determined that these studies determined that the lateralization doesn't do anything. It doesn't add anything unique to the treatment. So it's the exposure piece that really makes the most movement. So, it's one of those things. I mean, you could have your, finger on your nose or in your ear and do exposure therapy and it's going to work. It's not because of where your finger was.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
But it is a treatment that people like and it tends to work, but not for why a lot of people think. If I were telling a relative to get treatment for PTSD, it would be prolonged exposure therapy and cognitive processing therapy.
Okay, so last couple of questions before we wrap this up. So, okay, the first one, I guess, is what would your practical advice be to a veteran who maybe listens to this interview, or they've just been recommended therapy, and they just think, like, please, like, I'm not doing that shit. Like, what the fuck does some guy in an office know about what I've been through? How's he going to help me just by chitty chatting? And it's totally understandable attitude, I think, as well. But what would be your advice to somebody that's suspicious of attending therapy?
Well, I think there is a general suspicion of therapy. I think it's probably concentrated among men, and it's probably even more concentrated among fighting men. And I think part of that does have to do with military culture. I mean, for the longest time, that's been, that the thought of going and getting help has been more taboo in military settings than other settings, for all the reasons we just discussed. But, all I can tell you is it works. Don't talk to me, talk to other vets who've done the treatment. One of the things that happens a lot is some of my veterans will tell their friends, and they come in. Some of my vets will tell their dads. These young guys who went to Iraq will tell their Vietnam vet fathers, or vice versa. And you're right. To a certain extent, I may have a lot of letters behind my name, but their word goes a lot further than mine. I would talk to somebody who's done the treatment. Do your own research. Trust the science. Don't trust me. Well, trust me, but don't just rely on one person's opinion. All I can tell you is that they work, and they work well. It's hard. It's training. How to do training. And give it a shot. What do you got to lose?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I do. I think it's a fair accusation to say that you don't know what a soldier's been through, but it doesn't necessarily follow that just because you don't know what they've been through, that you can't help them.
Yeah.
And also, the other thing, just that I'd recommend as a service user myself, is you can go give these things a try, and you don't have to tell anybody. Do you know what I mean? Right. If you want to kind of protect that sense of identity, you don't want people to know you're going to therapy. People don't have to know you're going to therapy, and also test drive your therapist as well. Make them earn your trust. Yeah. You shop around until you find someone that you click with. I think would be my advice. Finally, though, beyond therapy, what do you think we should be doing at a societal level to help veterans come home?
Let me just go back a second and for vets, to answer your question, go to my TED site, go to my site on TED and look at a link that I have on there called About Face. And that link is this giant video gallery of other vets who have gone through the treatments that I'm talking about. Hear it from them, But coming to your question, what can we do? Oh gosh, how about not going to war?
Okay, yeah. However, it's an unrealistic expectation, isn't it?
Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, I think we should always strive towards that. I think we should continue to strive to understanding why we go to make war with one another. I think the impulse runs on some very ancient, very volatile, very primitive hardware.
Do you think there's anything like just at a community level? Because it's that's where these veterans are returning to is the communities. Is there anything that, I don't know, anything practical, a change of attitude?
Yeah, so ending all wars, I agree, is probably not very practical at this point. but yeah, at the community level, sure. I mean, one thing that Sebastian Junger talks about in his book Tribe is that, maybe at the community level, we can try to emulate the tribal structure in a way, in some tangible way, like providing a forum for vets to come back and talk about their experiences so that it's not so foreign to us. I mean, during the bombings of London during World War II, everybody knew what the ravages of war were like, because they lived it. Here, today, we fight wars in foreign lands, and it's often, they're two different worlds. But I think, providing a forum to hear about these things, for veterans to tell about war, and I think that falls on veterans as well. I mean, yes, other people may not understand exactly what it's like to be in theater, but they're not going to get any understanding of it if you don't try to explain it to them. And so I've had a lot of patients who took the time to explain what the experiences were like. I've had a lot of veterans who have actually shared the recordings from their experiences in prolonged exposure with their spouses, with their brothers, their mates, and it gets them. It goes a long way to helping them connect around these incredibly important events in their life. So there's a lot we can do. There's a lot we can do towards destigmatization. I think you're doing a lot by opening up a forum for talking about this stuff. I mean, the more people know about the treatments, the better. I mean, bottom line is the treatments are there. They work. Let's get people into them. Let's get these known. Let's get, people should know that these are the go-to treatments for PTSD, and to avoid, maybe avoid the treatments that are kind of haven't really been studied as a first line approach. So I think education is key.
Okay, right, Hector. Before I let you go, quick fire questions. First one is, do you have any book recommendations, either on this topic or just anything else you feel would be of value to the listeners?
Oh, sure. And a couple of them are listed. A couple of them are listed on my website. One is called Sex and War by Malcolm Potts and Thomas Hayden, which is a really brilliant, mind-opening foray into why we go to war, how it's based on our reproductive psychology. Tribe by my friend Sebastian Junger. It's an excellent book. Fields of Combat by Erin Finley, who is an anthropologist, but she's an anthropologist who did case studies on and ethnography actually on veterans coming back and from war and the first person narratives of what their experiences were like, what it was like for them to access care. David Grossman's book on killing, that's a really good read. I recommend that my veterans read that book as well. There's a lot to read out there. Those would probably be my top 5, or was that 6? I don't know.
Well, I'll list all them in the show notes anyway. Okay, if you could have unlimited funding to research anything you liked, however niche or bizarre, what would it be and why?
Oh, what would I study if I could study whatever I wanted to?
Unlimited funding.
Oh my gosh, I would study probably genetics. I would study evolutionary psychology. I would travel the world and hang out with indigenous populations and learn from them about how they live, how they cope with the challenges of living, with warfare, with rearing children, with relationships. I love evolutionary science. I think it's like other fields. Other fields explain how. A lot of times they explain surface level phenomenon. Evolutionary science explains why we do things. And I think the field is understudied. I think the field is underrepresented. I think we have a lot to learn from that, and I really do think we can improve humanity by giving evolutionary science a greater place in our discussions about world affairs, about politics, economics, PTSD, war, things like that.
Yeah, just quickly, that's reminded me of my own book recommendation. It's a book called Angst. I think it's called the Evolutionary Origins of Anxiety and Depression, and that's pretty much the only book I know of on like a popular book that covers general mental health from an evolutionary perspective. So that's my recommendation. Anyway, if you could take the reins of power at the Department of Health, what policy would you implement to improve the mental well-being of the general public?
Oh, geez. If I could take the reins, I would probably invest a lot in research and dissemination. And I would probably invest a lot in interfacing with the press to talk about what works and what doesn't work. I think there are frontiers such as studying the human genome and seeing how that impacts mental health, and in the future I envision making changes to the human genome in various ways that could treat people. But that's a tough question. I don't often think of policy questions because I'm a frontline provider. But I think that's what I would do. I would really push the science as far as I could, and the dissemination. And people have to know about the topics you and I are talking about.
Okay, what, if anything, keeps you up at night?
Well, I worry about war. I worry about environmental destruction. I worry about overpopulation. I think overpopulation is something that environmentalists don't tackle enough as the ultimate cause of our environmental woes. I mean, we're reproducing so fast. That is the ultimate cause. There's not enough put in place to slow our reproduction. So what happens when we reproduce? Resources get scarcer, and we start fighting for them. And that's something on the horizon that I worry about, for me possibly, but also for my children and my grandchildren and future generations. That the legacy we're leaving humanity is something that really, that does keep me up at night. And so part of the things that I write are geared towards, one small drop and towards coming up with solutions.
What mistakes do you continue to make despite knowing better?
No, gosh, I work too much. That's for sure. I work too much. I do a lot of writing in my spare time, and you've got to.
When you say you work too much, in what way is that affecting you though? Is that missing out on something, or just knackering yourself out, burnout?
Yeah, well, burnout's always a concern. I mean, apart from my 9 to 5, after I clock out, I do write. I've got another book project on the horizon, looking at the evolutionary psychology of politics. And,
interesting.
What drives things like Brexit and Donald Trump and the left-right divide. I wish I had more time to write, to get some of these. I must have 10 books swirling around in my head just at any given moment. It's just the time.
Okay, final 3. What part of your career are you most proud of?
Oh gosh, all of it. I really enjoy what I do, the day-to-day, the making differences in people's lives. That's immensely rewarding. It's personally very rewarding. I mean, I have been tempted to leave the clinical work to go into academia full-time because I love it. I mean, that is what drives me. I write when I can't sleep. I spend time, I wake up in the middle of the night and write, but I love the day-to-day. It's when you can have such a central part in helping somebody change their life completely, turn it around and give new meaning to it. It's a tremendous experience. And like I tell my guys, I'm only the trainer. You guys do the hard work. So I don't want to take credit for the work they do. They do the hard work. They're the ones talking about the stuff that really bothers them. But it's a great process. I love it. If I look back when I'm old, I think, well, I've done some good. And the contributions that I'm making into the field of evolutionary science, I think, in that way you do research and you inch humanity a step forward, whereas you do clinical work, you're inching, forward person by person, So I like what I do. I'm fortunate in that respect. I like what I do.
Outside of family and career, what investment of time or money has brought you the most joy or fulfillment?
Oh boy. Well, I'm also an ultra marathoner. I haven't done that in a while because I've been pretty busy, but it's something I took up recently. I like that. So an ultra marathon is anything over, a marathon. So I've done 35 miles for you. I've done a 50 miler before.
Wow.
That was fun. Gives you time to think. Burns off a lot of stress hormones. I kind of write in my head while I'm running, and that's been a real joy.
Okay, the big one. What do you think is the key to happiness? Oh
boy, love. We are so much of So, I mean, I think that can vary. That's a giant question. Boy, you really got me, don't you? I think so much of our brain is geared towards interacting with other people and communing with other people around this human experience of ours, and so the quality of those relationships. I think that varies from person to person, pursue what you love. I think it can be work. I think individual meaning can vary so much, but quality of relationships is key among all the life pursuits that we follow. So
I like that answer. Would you believe I've never had that answer in 31 or 32 episodes, whatever. No one's come up with love and human interaction as the key to happiness. Not that I don't think they have anyway. I don't remember that one being mentioned.
Yeah, oh, really? Wow. I imagine people just stutter and it's like, well, I know that's. I mean, how do I answer that?
I think it's just sort of demonstrates that maybe we do need a bit more love in the world if no one's actually thinking that's the key to happiness. So, yeah, Hector, it's been a privilege. It's been very interesting. Have you got any links, anything, social media, websites, anything you like to recommend the listeners pay a visit to?
Well, my link, Hector-Garcia.com, and, it links to TED. I think I love TED. It's just a wonderful organization. You want to learn about the world and, you can learn about a topic in 17 minutes or less. Love it. My talk's there. Other talks are there. Hector-Garcia.com.
Okay. Hector Garcia, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, folks, if you enjoyed this episode, actually, for those of you who didn't enjoy this episode, you guys can bugger off and skip this bit because it doesn't apply to you. But if you did enjoy this episode and you'd like to help support this podcast, there are a number of ways you can do so. You could blast out a little mention on social media saying, yeah, check this knobhead out, he's actually pretty good. You could like our Facebook page or leave us a review there, even better. Just search for My Own Worst Enemy on Facebook. I'm sure we'll pop up. You could leave us a positive review on iTunes or Stitcher or whichever podcast service you happen to use. It's always a nice way of encouraging new listeners to give us a whirl. Or, if you're feeling particularly generous and you feel that this podcast is genuinely adding some value and you'd like to support it in a more long-term sense, then you can become a subscriber for as little as £1 a month. Or you could just make a one-off donation, again, for as little as £1. So, yeah, if you'd like to sponsor the podcast, just go to myownworstenemy.org/support, but only if you can afford it, and, no donations from stolen credit cards either, please. Can't be arsed with that hassle. So, yeah, plenty of things to keep you busy there while I go busy myself putting the next episode together. So, in the meantime, as I always say, behave yourselves, but not too much, and I'll see you again next time.